Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be back with you again. And tonight I'm really, really pleased to finally have on board um, one of one of the journalists that I followed for a very long time, who has been on the ground in Donbass in Ukraine since I think before 2014. If you don't already follow him, please do get on board with George Eliason. George, I'm so pleased to have you here tonight.
That's very kind. I'm glad to be here, Vanessa.
George, can you just let everyone know how you came to be in the Donbass? And basically, I think you asked me a very similar question. Like, were you already a journalist when you went there? Or did you just kind of follow your path into recording what was going on, what you were seeing?
Well, it was exactly that. I moved here a few years before the war, like 3 years
Mm,
before the war, and I actually um, lived in West Ukraine for 2 years. My wife is from Donbass.
right.
We've been married for 30 years.
Wow.
Anyway, she had a few brothers over in central West Ukraine. It was the Vinnytsia region,
Mm,
and we had a house there. Most of our family's in Donbass. One of our uncles got sick, so we came here, helped him out, and we stayed in Donbass because that's where most of the family is.
mm,
And the war kind of came to us. It was after Maidan started is when I started writing about all of this and started looking into who the people were that were uh, behind the events and involved in the events here. And it was just the weirdest thing. I mean, can you imagine in 2014 talking to a publisher saying, no, really, there are Nazis in Ukraine today. They're here.
And what
And
was the
trying to,
response? What was the response from the publishers?
well, he's Jewish.
Mm,
And his response was, what the hell are you talking about? So, and that's when I started doing very detailed work. I wrote the first articles on the political side of this in 2014. And they were scared to publish. They were scared for me. They were scared of everything.
mm,
And they started cutting into the articles a bit, but they started publishing almost right away. So it was actually the second article I wrote that was the first one published there. Well,
mm.
the Ukrainians at that point had infected media so bad that you've heard of Oleg Tignybok.
Yes.
He was
Yeah.
probably the most famous Nazi of the period, right?
Mm,
Well, his aunt was a good friend of the lead in-house editor at that platform, and I didn't know that. So I'm publishing about Nazis, and she's publishing about how democratic Oleg Tignybok is. Even at the same time, he's giving Nazi salutes in Kiev. I mean, that's how crazy it was.
wow. And how did, because you mentioned Maidan, um, not only Maidan, of course, the massacre at Mariupol also. Is this the first time that you had experienced violence on this level?
I had never, no, I never had, and all of a sudden it's coming. In February 2014, I was writing about how the war was just about to start in Donbass, who
Mm,
was involved, what was going on, and it was the weirdest thing because the people in Donbass didn't believe me it was going to go that far.
oh, really?
Yeah, no one believed it was going to go that far because since 1991, They were all, one country, Ukraine. And then before that, they were all part of the Soviet Union together. And they didn't understand the amount of hate these people had for them or where it came from. It was kind of written out of history.
Mm. So when you were living in the west of Ukraine, were you, so before Maidan, before 2014, were you aware of this rising hatred, of this rise in fascism, ultranationalism, and Nazism? Were you aware of it?
Well, it wasn't rising. It was just there. And
Mm.
you would meet someone once in a great while. My first year there, I asked people, what should I learn, Ukrainian or Russian? They said, oh, definitely learn Russian because everybody speaks it.
Right.
That's the language you want to talk.
Mm.
And it was, for the most part, and it still is for the most part, if you get down to the people level, um, they're very much a Russian people.
Mm.
And it's their country that's walking away from them. I'm talking about Ukraine.
Mm. Yeah, that's that's a very interesting perspective. So even after what happened in 2014, and I mean, even the media, the mainstream media in the West that generally um, misinforms and misleads and lies, even they, post 2014, were reporting on the Azov battalions, the Nazi brigades, and so on. At what point did people in Donbass really understand what was happening, really understand that the war had come to them and that they were having to pitch battle against what I presume previously had been their neighbors and their countrymen?
It was going on from late winter onward. You had Pravi Sector, which is an umbrella group. What became Azov was part of it, and so were all the other groups. They were coming into Donbass and murdering people, making examples.
Mm.
And from the early spring onward, people started defending themselves out in the streets with sticks. And then these people came with guns, which they didn't have here for the most part. A couple people, they raided the armory,
Mm.
started the protests here, and things picked up from there. Even then, at that, most people were pretty sure that there would be a negotiated settlement because they didn't understand that the government no longer looked at them as people, that it was actual fascist government that stood up. And part of it is because Ukraine was such really a peaceful place before. The crime was negligent.
Mm.
Violence was, uh, I wouldn't say unheard of, but it was almost comical because two guys would fight in the street and then get up and be friends and go have a drink or something or whatever.
Yeah.
One would make sure the other one got home okay. I mean, that was Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it wasn't.
Mm.
And it took about a year for people to get over the shock of that. They were already fighting pitched battles, tank battles,
Mm.
and it was shock. It wasn't an invasive force. It was people that were born here.
Ugh, yeah. But how, I mean, just to have an understanding, because how, in your opinion, were people so quickly turned against each other? How, I mean, who engineered that? Who orchestrated that? Because, you're describing an environment, a community environment where, yeah, there were probably bar brawls very much. I used to live in rural France, and that was very similar. You know, people would get in a fight in the man bar, I always used to call it, and then carry each other home. So
Mhm.
how did that community get so toxic so fast? Who engineered that? Who had the power and the resources, and the ability, and how did they do it, in your opinion?
Well, I actually documented it. It was two British companies. One of them is called Strategic Communications Laboratories. The other one is IOTA Global.
Mm.
Um, Cambridge Analytica was a subset of Strategic Communications Labs. They engineered the entire information war that's going on today. That's them.
Mm.
The guy that designed the model is his name is Joe Harding. He lives in Virginia. He's designed a 5-point strategic plan and implemented it in Ukraine. And the focus of the media war was never into Ukraine or Russia. It was always into Western media.
Mm.
As early as 2015, they were openly discussing all the deplatforming that they were going to do. Do you remember Proper Not?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Those lists came from one of them. It was two lists. One of them Joe Harding wrote. The other one, a gentleman that was a subcontractor named Aaron Wiesberg, wrote the other one.
Mm.
Aaron Wiesberg also he coined the term Kremlin troll and every other term that goes along with it,
Mm.
as well as following people on networks so they could turn that information over to the Ukrainians
Yeah.
and destroy their lives.
Mm.
Um,
Just to
it,
explain to everyone who Propanot was, because they might not have heard of him, or the entity rather than him.
well, in 2015, Michael Weiss came up with a concept that they had to, without coming across as censorship from the community of media, they had to blacklist journalists and media platforms that were out of line and going against the narrative that they were putting together.
Mm.
So what they wanted was basically a committee that would decide these things, and the rest of the media would support it, which is essentially what they did with Proper Not.
Mm.
Proper Not was a vehicle they designed to brand journalists and media outlets, platforms, um, social media influencers as Russian trolls, as Russian influencers, as this, that. At the same time, they were turning just being near the word Russian into a swear word. So that was all part of one process.
Yeah. And
In
Michael Weiss, of course, had history in Syria also,
Mhm. Of course he
as
does.
promoting and supporting the armed groups led by Al Qaeda and various branches of Al Qaeda. So yeah, you know that, and we're seeing also. I think I put a tweet out today. Matthew Van Dyke, who was also implanted not only in Libya but then in Aleppo with the armed groups from, I think, 2012 onwards. He was famous for the leaked messages between him and Brown Moses, who later became Bellingcat, and we'll talk
Mm-hmm.
about your experience with Bellingcat, demonstrating that the terrorist groups had access to chemical weapons. And of course, those leaked messages have largely been buried by Bellingcat and the NATO member state aligned media, etc. And now Matthew Van Dyke, in my opinion, is running a sort of CIA bot troll farm, which is designed to do a very similar job to Propanot. was doing previously. And now, of course, you have the NATO trolls, you have the Article 5 guys, and so on. It is a war on social media. And I think it's such an insidious war. And when you think how they can influence opinion through these entities, through these agencies, I mean, it is really frightening, right? And people like, for example, Eva Bartlett have effectively been doxed by members of these clusters and these cartels. Have you ever come under any such attack?
Yeah, I've been threatened quite often by the people running the InfoWar because of the exposure I gave them. They're actually running it out of the State Department, out of the US AGM. It used to be called the BBG, the Board of Broadcasting Governors. And they bring you Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's them.
Mm.
But it's the board of the ASGM that you need to pay attention to, because these are all the owners of all the major networks and in different forms of media in America. So if you go against the narrative that they set out, which is set up right now by Joe Harding, you lose access in Washington, D.C. And if you're a national player, this would make you a regional player pretty quickly if you don't have access, to government leaders, etc.
Mm-hmm.
To give you an idea of the weight they carry, when they want to get a message out, they blast it out over a few thousand media platforms.
Yeah.
And we're talking about Fox, CNN, all the way to high-end blogs. And it's when you see all the same messaging, okay, especially about a non-news story item, something that shouldn't be, why would that be a news item? But everybody's blasting it all of a sudden. That's the messaging coming out of the State Department that's doing it. They actually set up a private contractor, set up shop there. That's what's going on now for Ukraine, Syria, South Central American countries.
China?
Yeah, China, Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean it's quite extraordinary, and it's a very powerful entity. Can you give us a little bit of background to Joe Harding? Where did he come from?
Well, Joe Harding, he originally, and it's his pride and joy is he was a Green Beret, communications. When he got out at the end of his military career, he shifted focus into the first of information operations. Retired military's old crows, or used to, which is all the old information operations leaders around the world. Now, he's worked with Michael Hayden setting up the NSA on some things. He's worked with NATO, CIA. He set up NATO Stratcom COE. That's his baby. EU versus Disinfo. Let's see. They've given the programming to Ukraine, about 5 other European countries, so they can all blast the same messaging about Russia and against people that they deem as supporting Russia, Russia-friendly issues, or about countries that Russia is friendly with. Now, Syria is its own case because, how long did they work to overthrow Assad? That's been on the table, but most of the anti-Assad stuff was actually coming out of Ukraine. It was the same group.
Right.
Those are the ones that were providing Bellingcat with their information. Bellingcat doesn't really have a lot of mojo. It was all provided by these people, which is some of it, well, some of it is just talking points that they want to push. Very little of what they have to say actually, hits the threshold to be called intelligence at all. So,
Yeah, I mean, I remember you coming up with the evidence that Bellingcat had direct ties to the SBU, didn't you? And that they
yes.
were being given information by the SBU. Can you just talk about that? Because, of course, people will know Bellingcat more in Syria, and they're shoring up, for example, the chemical weapons narratives, but all of the narratives that demonized the Syrian government and Russia and the allies of Syria during the last 11 years. But you've been following them, I think, very closely from inside Ukraine. So it would be interesting for people to understand how their role now crosses over from Syria to Ukraine.
Well, when they started, when they were, let's see, their first Ukraine contract was MH17. SCL had a contract with the Canadian government to do the information operations surrounding that. Cloud things up, make sure there was never an investigation. Now, the Ukraine unit had been up and going for a few years, and they'd been working with SCL. They overthrow governments, it's what they do. As we rolled into 2015, late 2014, they pulled together what was called the Ministry of Information Policy. And that's where they corralled all the OSINT in Ukraine and information operations. Bellingcat helped develop Miratovitz, Ukraine's hit-for-hire site. They showed them how to find people in real time.
So that's the kill list. That's
yes.
the kill list that Eva's on. Right. Okay.
The side of that was Aaron Wiesberg, who taught them to geolocate people based on their IP addresses.
Wow.
Now, this guy taught Homeland Security, the FBI, intelligence section, NATO, and so on and so forth. All right. So he helped them put that together. At the same time, Bellingcat was targeting different groups for the Ukrainians as they went along. They were working in Syria, and the deputy minister of information policy at the time, what was his name? Zelensky. He called Bellingcat his Western partners.
Right.
And Bellingcat used to go and do seminars for these Ukrainians so they could do their job better. Like they were working. As a matter of fact, when Crystal Grozov came up, he actually thought he got hacked. I believe it was around Christmas 2017. And he contacted the Deputy Minister of Information Policy in Ukraine. His Twitter handle is UA Intel, UA Intelligence, if that gives you any clues on. Kind of proud of it. But Crystal contacts him on Twitter and says, I think I've been hacked, but I'm not sure. And so they're going back and forth, and this guy that's running information ops in Syria, the US, Ukraine, is giving him advice, to secure his computer. That's how tightly they were working together.
Wow. What, according to you, was the real story behind MH17? Because there was Kolomoisky involvement, correct? I mean, I didn't follow it too closely, I must admit, because, we were fairly buried at the time in what was going on in Syria.
Right.
But if you can sort of run through what you think the scenario was over MH17, and also the timing of MH17 in relation to what's happening now in Ukraine, why was it important?
Well, in terms of the biggest takeaway for MH17 is there was never really an investigation.
Mm.
Investigators were given talking points by the Ministry of Information Policy. They did it all. They fabricated evidence. They fabricated stories. They did all these things. And if Ukraine wasn't involved, why would they? It's, that's just that simple. So we have no investigation. And we have a lot of fabrication coming from the Ukrainian side. Now, Ukraine signed on to the investigation that they had to approve all the information about the investigation for it to be used. But can you imagine that? You're under suspicion for shooting down a plane, but they can't use or look at information that might implicate you.
Right.
That's what happened there. Now, when that happened, the Canadian government hired SCL, and they sent IOTA Global to run the information operation on that. So that's where all the stories started coming out about how the people in Donbass did this, blah, 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 blah. What they actually had was a recording from the day before when they shot down a cargo plane. Okay, yes, did we shoot it down? We shot it down. Okay, it was a cargo plane the day before or 2 days before that. Did they think maybe they'd shot down another cargo plane? Well, the day MH17 happened, they didn't shoot it down, but you see a plane coming down, you have a war going on, and you have to understand that the people in Donbass are not professional soldiers. These people are school teachers, university professors, chemists, anything else, retail, coal miners, steel workers. So they see a plane coming down, they think, well, yeah, it must be our side because we don't have planes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the logic to it. There's a plane dropping out of the sky, so we must have shot it down. Now, there might have been a comment on that in social media, but they didn't have the bucks. That was the thing. In June, one buck showed up in Lugansk.
Yeah, recording now. We lost electricity. If people wonder why there is a little bit of a break in the interview, but George, you're back now.
My apologies.
No problem at all. I totally understand. Please carry on with what you were saying about MH17.
So, you have this plane coming down, and all these people that just a few months before or even a month before were working everyday jobs, and they see this plane coming down. The day before, they shot down a cargo plane. All through the spring and in the summer, jets were coming and attacking. You had the attack at the Lugansk administration building. Okay. Helicopters were strafing people that had sticks in their hands, if anything. So they see this, and yes, they light up social media, and then they find out it's a passenger jet. But as I was saying before, I got cut off, the only Buck missile launcher in the area was in Lugansk. They only had half a Buck. They didn't have the guidance system, and the missile system itself was broken. They needed to repair it. They didn't know enough about the system to even realize that at first. And that was in June when they discovered it.
Mm.
Okay. So it takes months to be able to train on these weapon systems before you can actually do anything with them.
Yeah.
It could be 6 months, a year. So to say that people coming from normal everyday jobs just jumped in and were able to target a jetliner flying at that altitude is just, it's beyond crazy.
Mm.
Um, the Russian army wasn't here. I actually went across Donbass in late summer, specifically checking passports. And it was spot checks. The officer driving me around went where I wanted him to. And he agreed before we left that he wasn't going to use his phone. He didn't make any phone calls. I
Mm.
just said, okay, go here, go here, go here, go here. And what I found was a lot of scared, angry people. They were a little upset because I was American. They didn't understand why I was there. And my Russian was so poor. I actually, imagine walking up to a frightened teenager that has a weapon. He's fighting in a war and saying, give me your documents and give me your weapon, give me your rifle right now.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was inspecting them. If you look at the rifles, everybody, the Ukraine and the US was saying that Russia was supplying, new weapons, blah, 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 blah. Well, all the weapons were from the 1960s. They were from a Soviet armory. The oldest weapon I saw was 1919.
Wow.
The guy was about 70 and it was his grandfather's. All right, a rifle. The newest weapon was 1972. And when you tell a scared kid, give me your weapon, give me your gun, the officer had to actually stand between me and the kid at one point because the kid was so scared, telling him, okay, he just wants to look at the date. And they have a manufacturing stamp on them, you know. The kid thought I wanted to take his weapon from him.
Mm.
So, it was an interesting time, but it needed to be done.
Mm. Yeah.
Everybody, about 95 or 6% had Ukrainian passports. The biggest contingency of foreigners I saw were Spanish, sorry.
Mm.
There were about 30 Spanish in one place. And there were a couple of Russians, yeah. There were a couple, both from Afghanistan. There were a couple of people from all over the place. But
Mm.
it was only, ones or twos or threes.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a lot of backup other than moral support at the
Mm.
very beginning.
So the stories that were circulating of a Russian invasion or of Russia supplying sophisticated weaponry to Donetsk and Luhansk were entirely false.
They were entirely false. The only
Mm.
sophisticated weapons that they came across, actually the first ones, were the ones that the Ukrainians were selling them.
Mm. On the black market, presumably.
Yeah, well, they crossed the
Yeah.
line with weapons, tanks.
Mm.
A lot of the tanks that the Donbass militias got, they bought off Ukrainians.
Wow. Okay. I hadn't heard that before, actually. So
I've
when you
actually
say
got a
them,
video.
they
I've got
bought
a
them from
video
the
of a sale.
Ukrainians. They bought them from the Ukrainians that were actually attacking them.
Yeah, it was the Ukrainian
Wow.
military.
Okay. Oh God. The corruption of war is quite extraordinary. You said you have videos of that?
I have a video of a sale of a tank. Yeah.
Right. So at what point do you think that Russia did start to get more seriously involved, if at all?
Well, Russia did have advisors here.
Mm.
All right. And that would be probably all of 2014 onward.
Right.
But the
Military
advice,
advisors, military,
yes,
yeah, trainers.
trying to shape up a civilian population into a standing militia. I
Mm.
mean, that was the big goal, I guess.
Mm.
Beyond that, they couldn't. And by into 2015, they became one of the guarantors of the Minsk Agreement.
Mm.
So the one thing that the Russians did, and they made both Donbass republics do, was to hold up every point of that agreement. So no matter what happens, in the end, if this ever goes to court or this goes south, neither it doesn't, one, make Russia look bad, two, neither of the republics could be blamed.
Mm.
It's just a very, you know, it's a very serious situation.
Mm. What actually, I mean, Western media now disappears largely the deaths of the people of Donetsk and Luhansk. And, this I feel viscerally because this reminds me so much of Syria, although
Mm-hmm.
Syria, of course, is on a much bigger scale. But, when people initially, when the media was describing the Syrian Arab Army as some kind of Assad militia or sectarian mafia outfit, etc. But very similar to how you've described Donbass, of course, the Syrian army is a conscript army, and the soldiers come from every walk of life. Many of them were formerly veterinarians, doctors,
Mm-hmm.
students, nurses, not soldiers, not professional soldiers, many of them, and they had to be conscripted and they had to be trained up very, very quickly. The weapons were ancient compared to, what you saw ISIS being equipped with, for example. If you see any of the armed gangs that have taken amnesty and reconciliation, they're driving around in brand new Toyota trucks or Hilux, whatever
Mm-hmm.
make you want, but they're brand new. Their weapons are brand new or at least very modern. Um, and I think it's important for people to understand the disproportionate nature of the war against the people of Donbass and, you know, equivalents in Syria. It was a disproportionate war. They weren't facing grassroots, in inverted
Right.
commas, rebels. They were facing a professional army of mercenaries, of military mercenaries, right? And I think, this is what I'm all the time trying to get across to people. This isn't a proportionate war. But why the Syrian army and why the people of Donbass have resisted, perhaps you can explain why from the perspective of the Donbass people. They resist. Why? Because they have no choice, because they believe in their cause. What is it that drives them on despite the terrible massacre that was carried out against them from 2014 onwards? What keeps them going?
Well, first of all, we've got to dispel the term cause. There was
Mm,
no cause.
mm,
Um, when it became clear that it was nationalists holding up the flags of the people that murdered their grandparents
mm,
across Ukraine, holding up the flags, holding up the politics, and that Ukraine had become the same politic that the Nazis, um, over 70 years ago, held dear while they were killing people of Donbass, grandparents, aunts, uncles, that point became clear. They knew that there was no giving up, that it was a matter of existentialism.
Mm.
And it was part of, I told you there was about a year of shock. You what it was like, being the first person writing seriously about this and saying, hey, there are real Nazis and they're in Ukraine. And trying to convince people and showing here's the proof.
Mm.
These poor people had to live through that shock on a personal level. Can you imagine Ukraine attacked every city on the day that city was liberated from Nazis? They made a point of it.
Wow.
All across Ukraine. So the day they celebrate, freedom from Hitler, freedom from Bandera, no more mass murders, is the day the mass murders start up again. And that was very, very, very purposeful.
Mm.
On top of that, you had everything that happened on, May 8th, Mariupol, May 8th, May 9th.
Yeah.
And it was very well filmed. And you got to watch people on the street filming on their phones, these nationalist groups coming in, seeing somebody just standing on a street corner, shooting them in the head, keep going, shooting 4 or 5 people. There's one video, guy gets shot right in front of the guy filming. It's through and through his shoulder. And I mean, it was just, one guy was marching in the parade in Mariupol, 70-year-old, they blew both his knees out.
Mm.
And that's what every day was like in the spring. So it was clear very quickly it was existential. It was clear that it was nationalist people that held 1930s, 1940s nationalism as the way to go politically for Ukraine that were doing it. That the grandparents of those people killed the grandparents of these people. But try living through all that shock, because it's not an invasive mercenary force. It's all coming from people that were your neighbor.
Yeah.
And families in Donbass were split. The propaganda and the info war was so bad for years that people outside of Donbass call their parents and grandparents in Donbass and curse them for being Russian. That's just how crazy it is.
Yeah. I mean, again, huge parallels in Syria. Certainly in the beginning, neighbors were turning on neighbors. I mean, very similar. I have countless stories of neighbors murdering neighbors suddenly. Suddenly neighbors becoming the enemy because they supported the government, etc. I mean, it is, there is such an element of shock and disbelief, that this is happening, that your neighbor has become your enemy, and not only your enemy, but if you don't shoot first, you're dead.
You're murdering.
Yeah. And I always remember speaking to, well, a number of people, but one very dear friend of mine who formed the civilian resistance in the Christian town of Malula, which is famous for still teaching the language of Christ, Aramaic, in the schools. And I remember him describing the first time he killed someone. And he said to me, you know, there was a split second where my conscience was saying to me, this is wrong. And then something snaps in me. And I realize if I don't pull the trigger, then he's going to pull the trigger and I'm dead. You know, it's very hard to describe to people how ordinary civilians are forced into a position of having to defend themselves. And it's such an awful, shocking, horrifying predicament for human beings to be put into. But where I'm against war, of course I am. Any person in their right mind would be. But I'm for people having the right to defend themselves against aggression, you know. Because in the West, there's always this tendency for this kind of pacifism that all war is bad, and there's not this understanding of what it takes, of the sacrifices made by human beings to defend not even their country, to defend their family, their daughter, their sister, their brother. You know, Palestine, another perfect example. Nobody wants to take up weapons. Nobody wants to strap a suicide belt to their waist, right? But when people are pushed to this extent, they have no alternative. There is no alternative. And I think unless you've lived through that, unless you've experienced it, it's a very difficult one to empathize with if you're living outside of this kind of environment. Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely would. It when Ukraine took over our area, for the time they did, and you know, you're actually put on a clock. You know, your shelf life's up, and you actually have a date and time when they're going to expire you. You can't leave because you're surrounded with tanks, heavy weapons, snipers. You can't move. Trying to do interviews, let people know what's going on. And then we're actually faced with the decision, okay, well, how are we going to do this? All right, well, when they start pulling people out to cleanse, I'm going to run out in the street with my passport and start yelling, stop, you can't do this. I'm going to get killed right away. But there's no weapon. Now, hoping for the shock value. Hold, there is an American here. And that wouldn't have worked. They knew I was there. That really didn't matter. The day before it was supposed to start, there was another American that was with the Ukrainians that parked outside my gate and was trying to figure me out, I guess. He never got out of his vehicle. If he did, he probably would have went missing a lot sooner. He ended up being killed about a month later. But, even him, he was nephew of Mykola Lebed, a very famous World War II sadist. And here he is fighting for Ukraine. Well, all the groups, believe it or not, in Ukraine, Syria, Taiwan, they're actually part of one larger group of ultranationalists or nationalists. They worked together for decades, and that's how they developed into the things they are now.
Can you go into a bit more detail about that, George? You mentioned it in our interview, I know, but can you go a bit further into that?
It started back in 1917, maybe. It was the Prometheus groups. The Prometheus groups had an Oriental section, Asian section, and of course European, and was groups that they were full-blown nationalists of a scale that would scare the German Nazis, and they did. The German Nazis were afraid of the Ukrainians' violence, all right, their sadism. But they organized under Stepan Bandera after the war, and he absorbed the Promethean groups. And, it goes from Ukraine all across Europe, down to the Levant and Taiwan. Bandera's best friend was actually Chiang Kai-shek over in Taiwan. And the protests now, the pro-democracy protests, are trying to overturn the anti-nationalist protests that were against the actual nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. So it went to a lighter form of nationalism, and now these protests are trying to turn it into a heavier nationalism. But you go back to, oh gosh, what's his name? Is a precursor to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's where they got all their violent philosophy from. Cubism. Okay, they're Cubists.
Right.
The leader of Cubism was friends with Bandera. They actually formed the Muslim Brotherhood, which led to all the violence in the Middle East. There were no such thing as a Muslim terrorist anywhere until this guy came in. And the Cubists everywhere, under whatever flag they're flying, are the ones that promote it, that push it.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary when you go into the history of these violent ultra-nationalist streams or entities, and how they've ended up in Ukraine now, because all of them pretty much are fighting there, from what I can figure out, from the Muslim Brotherhood to the Wahhabists to obviously Zionists, right? So they've all converged on Ukraine, and against Russia, of course. That's probably a subject for going into much greater depth at another time, George, but I wanted to quickly, because we haven't got too much time left, and I don't want to keep you for too long, because I know you've had a long day. Can we just touch on what's happening at the Zaporizhia? Have I pronounced it correctly?
Zaporozhye.
Thank you. Nuclear plant, because for me this is just one of the scariest moments of the war. We know that the Ukrainians have struck within 300 meters of the reactors at the plant, and they're using, the sky is full of UAVs, of drones, right? Russia is, I presume, bringing in military to guard the plant against attack.
Yes.
You mentioned something very worrying to me today. Can you talk about that a little bit and just describe what is really happening? Because, of course, again, legacy media is coming to the rescue of the NATO proxy and claiming that Russia is shelling itself within the compound of the nuclear plant. Can you just give a little bit of a description as to what's really going on?
Well, Ukraine started using suicide drones. They're shelling, firing rockets, and they're determined to set the plant off. Now, what's thing is, if the Russians hadn't taken over the plant, with the spent fuel, the Ukraine uses a dry storage for it. They don't use a wet storage underwater. They're in casks.
Mm.
But where that storage area is, they found 30 tons or 40 tons of enriched uranium and 40 kilos of plutonium. The Ukrainians were setting about to making real dirty bombs. This is a nuclear power plant. There is no reason for that material to be there to begin with. It's not something that you'd use in a plant, but it is something that you could hide there.
Mm.
It would be a lot easier to hide than other places because you're not going to have a radiation spike. Now, part of what Ukraine's doing, if the dome itself takes a hit, the domes are made for that. The concrete's 3-4 feet thick. It's made to take missile strikes as a just in case, but not repeatedly. The problem is the cooling system. The cooling pipes are not all inside the dome. They leave the dome. They go to another building where the cooling plant is. Ukraine cut off power to that. And what it does is the water stays hot and it builds more pressure. If they hit those pipes, do you remember that big cloud that went up over Fukushima?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
That was the steam pipes breaking,
Yeah.
being smashed. That's a worst event for a nuclear power plant. But at Zaporozhye, because of the way the plant's set up, and this is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, it would be 3 times that. It would blanket Europe. It would blanket Ukraine. It would blanket into Russia. It would go into Turkey. It would go. That's what we're looking at. It took Chernobyl 15 days for the contamination cloud to circumvent the globe. I'm not saying this would be any faster because it's a jet stream, but it would be much heavier. That's a fact.
Oh. But I mean, are they really crazy enough to do this? Who's I mean, Zelensky surely isn't in charge at this point. So who is pushing to this extent? I mean,
well, it's the same people that have been pushing the whole time.
Yeah.
It's the nationalists behind it. You have to understand that Ukraine, after it left the Soviet Union, they actually signed a contract to receive the powers of state and symbols of state from World War II nationalists. The contract was they had to build a nationalist Ukraine under the terms the World War II nationalists prescribed. So from 91 to 2006, they didn't do a good job, so they had the Orange Revolution. And the diaspora wasn't happy with that, so in 2014, they had the real revolution.
Mm.
Blowing up a nuclear power plant isn't something that they're really worried about. They consider the population of Ukraine to be Russian, therefore they need to kill them anyway.
Oh.
So
but what
they
about
really
the rest
don't.
Of the world?
Well, they don't care about that. But here's the point: you'll have a nuclear disaster, so they'll have money coming in for 60 years, 100 years.
Mm.
Think of it that way. The war can't last forever, but if you create a situation that perpetuates because it's a disaster, the money keeps coming in forever. And it's the people that are getting the money now that'll be there to get the money after that happens, whether they're in Poland or whether they're in Greece or the US or whatever. They'll still have an office in Ukraine collecting that money.
Jesus. What can prevent it? What will stop it?
The Russian army destroying the forces that are doing it. Now, there's two options. They can basically put the plant in neutral, which shut everything down, okay? Put it on safety. Essentially, that depressurizes everything. So even on a direct hit, now you get a spill, but you're not getting, you're getting what's in the pipes without the pressure.
Yeah.
So everything's local. The contamination spreads across Zaporozhye and into other parts of Ukraine a little bit, but not anywhere near significantly. Because of the concentration, the place won't be livable again. And everybody there, unfortunately, everybody there will be a casualty.
Including the Russian army and the actual plant employees, presumably.
Right.
Wow.
And the townspeople, and if it gets into the water supply, contamination.
So
it all depends on.
That's the best case scenario to some degree, right? Unless suddenly they decide that they're not going to go ahead with trying to create this scenario. That's the
problem. The big problem with this scenario is that it takes so long and so much money to get the plant back up. It's a lot more cost effective to put an army at the plant, an entire army, and attack anybody and everybody that's attacking the plant.
So they haven't yet decided to put the plant into neutral, basically. That's what you're saying, right?
They haven't yet decided, and I think they're leaning toward, because they have to do it anyway, go in, attack, destroy whatever's attacking the plant, clear a radius that Ukraine does not have the ability to attack from inside it, or from outside it, rather. So if you're looking at 60 kilometers, 120 kilometers from the plant, 200 kilometers from the plant, and then attacking, concentrating on the weapons that can fly that far. Get rid of them all.
Yeah. So that seems to be the first plan of action, basically, according to how you understand it or how you read it.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at right now. They whichever they're going to do, they need to do quick. Now, if they're going to bring the plant to safety, okay, put it on safety, that's a very, very fast process.
Right.
Very, very fast process.
24 hours, 2 days.
Yeah, you could do it. Yeah. You could do it very, very fast.
Right. And at the same time, of course, Russia is playing by the book and trying to get the I can never remember the acronym, the nuclear yeah, that's it, to come in and inspect, right? I mean, again, the story being put out is that Russia is blocking any visit, but actually that is even being countered by some semi-honest mainstream outlets that have recorded the fact that Nebensia has effectively called the emergency meeting and has asked for a visit to inspect the plant. And of course, I'm guessing that is part of the process of trying to prevent the targeting of the plant, right?
Well, the former head of the American Nuclear Commission actually wrote an article saying that the IAEA needs to respect its agreement with Ukraine and not go inspect the plant. Stay away from it. And Ukraine can do what they want, basically, until they get the plant back.
God.
And that's the former head of the NRC saying that.
It's just, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's if people aren't getting it by now, that the lunatics are in charge of the asylum, I don't know what else can demonstrate it more than this scenario around the nuclear plant. Really, you know, I mean, it's terrifying.
It is, but it's still a part of a greater whole. Ukraine is using the war to cleanse the Russianness out of its population.
Yeah.
They're actually in one city the mayor told the population to stay at home. The army's coming to check your phones. If there's anything on there, you're going to be arrested, and this is the way it is. Indian government told people, if the army leaves your area, you need to leave right then, or you'll be arrested. You'll be put on a target list. So they expect people to, you have a home, you've built it for 30 years, all the work, your possessions. Across Ukraine, it's mostly rural areas. They have livestock. So what are they supposed to do? Just open the gate and let these things out? Good luck, cow.
Yeah.
They expect people to do this. There's no jobs, no place for them to go, no place to receive them, because you're talking tens of millions of people, and Ukraine right now doesn't have an economy. So what do they plan on doing with these people?
Oh, yeah, it's a very bleak scenario, and it's just heartbreaking how the Ukrainian people, while the West is claiming that it's defending the Ukrainian people, of course it isn't. It's destroying them deliberately, just as it has done, in every single country that it has targeted since its existence.
In Donbass, the mood is upbeat, regardless. Every day the war moves out of another area, and that's that's new neighborhoods that aren't being shelled every day.
Yeah.
And that's how they look at it.
And I mean, extraordinary, I have to say, actually, and you can perhaps attest to this, but incredible footage of the rebuilding process.
Yeah.
I mean, is this for real? Because it's very difficult. I mean, I'm living in Syria. I mean, because of sanctions, because of all sorts of reasons, the rebuilding process has been retarded. But in Mariupol, for example, and in areas of Donbass that have been fully liberated, it's quite extraordinary to see the footage of the rebuild.
Yeah, believe it or not, it's been going on all through the war. The leader of the country is called Glava here. Well, it means literally leader. It's the president of the country. Glava Pasichnik has been rebuilding the roads that were destroyed, starting in 2014, from 2019 on. That's when he got in the office. These were entirely destroyed roads. They're doing the war, he's repaving the roads, he's rebuilding the bridges, they're fixing buildings, they're doing this, it's just, the guy's nonstop. And as far as Mariupol goes, you have to understand that it's a very historic city. It's an important city, and there's a lot of pride attached to it. So yeah, they're going to do the rebuild very quickly. Kharkov will be the same thing, whatever damage Kharkov sustains.
Yeah. Oh, George, there's so much that I could continue asking you about. I hope that you'll agree to come back on in the not too distant future and talk to me again. And I want to thank you really for your absolutely tireless dedication to getting the truth out. One of the, rare on the ground journalists these days, and totally hats off to you. You're brave. As I said, you're totally dedicated to information, to getting information out there and allowing people to evaluate for themselves. And that is the job that we should all be doing. And I really want to thank you for doing it, because it's invaluable right now. And thank you for coming on tonight and talking to me.
Well, thanks for the kind words. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk anytime.
All right, George, I'll let you go. And please take care of yourself. Look after yourself and your family. And hopefully speak again very soon. Take care, George.
Bye-bye.